All right, so we've talked about real numbers, rational and irrational. Now we're going to talk about non-real numbers that we call imaginary. All right, and the imaginary number is called I. Okay? Now, I is the square root of -1. So let's write that down. That's an I. Okay? Because we talked about how you can't take the square root of a negative number. That's not real. Okay? So it's imaginary. All right? So I is the square root of -1. That's what I represents. And you'll notice that we never use I as a variable because within the math world, I represents the imaginary number. All right, so if we want to simplify the square root of -32, we're first going to pull out the I, okay? We're going to factor out the I. So that's the same thing as saying square root of -1 times the square root of 32, okay? And we know that that is I. Okay? And then we can simplify the square root of 32. And we know that that will break down into the square root of 2 and the square root of 16. The square root of 16 is 4. So we bring out that 4. So we have 4i, and then we still have that square root of 2. And so that is the square root of 32 simplified. Now let's take a look at example number 2. Again, we want to pull out the I first. So we can say 5i square root of 6. So in order to make this 6 positive, just pull out that I. Minus I square root of 24. And then we can go ahead and simplify that. Well, the 6 isn't going to break down any further, but the 24 can break down into the square root of 4 times the square root of 6. And what's the square root of 4? 2. So that's minus 2i square root of 6. Bring down our 5i square root of 6. Now, are these both I square roots of 6? Yes. So 5 minus 2 gives you 3. Because you had like terms, you can simplify those. So 3i square root of 6 is your answer. All right, now let's take a look at example number 3. Remember to pull out your i's first. So we have I square root of 3 times I square root of 27. Okay? So now we can multiply I times I, which is I squared. And then square root of 3 times square root of 27 is square root of 81. Well, the square root of 81 is 9. Now, what do you think I squared would be? Well, let's see. If I is square root of -1, and I square both sides, what happens with this square and the square root? They cancel out, so you get -1. All right, so this I squared can be replaced with -1, and what's 9 times -1? -9. Okay? Now, if I squared is -1, what do you think I cubed is? What do you think I cubed is? Well, it's the same thing as I times I squared, right? I times I squared, well, what was I? What was I squared? So wouldn't that be negative square root of -1? So I cubed is negative square root of -1. What do you think I to the 4th is? How about I to the 5th? What about I to the 6th? We'll talk about that later. Remember, pull out your i's first. Okay? Now you can either multiply or you can simplify. I'm going to go ahead and simplify that square root of 75. So I'm going to say that breaks down into the square root of 25 and the square root of 3. So I have I square root of 5 times 5I square root of 3. All right, now when we multiply, we have I times 5I, so 5I squared. And then 5 times 3 is 15 under that radical. The I squared gives us negative 5, square root of 15. All right, so let's take a look at example number 5. Okay, again, the first thing we want to do is pull out the i's. So we have 4i square root of 18 over I square root of 12. Well, then we can take a look at our 18 and our 12, and we can say, okay, well, our i's are going to cancel, and that's 4 times the square root of 18 over 12, which if you reduce that, it becomes 4 square root, of 3 over 2. Well, now we can simplify that 3 over 2 by multiplying by 2 over 2. And so we get 4 square root of 6 over 4, and then the square root of 4 is 2. So that gives us 4 square root of 6 over 2, which is 2 square root of 6. And so that's our answer for number 5. 2 square root of 6. So now let's take a look at example number 6. Again, we want to pull out the i's first. Okay, so we have 15 over I squared of 32, and the square root of 32 can break down into the square root of 16 times the square root of 2. So that gives us 15 over 4I square root of 2. And then, because I is really a radical, we need to rationalize this expression, so we're going to multiply by I square root of 2. And whatever we do to the bottom, we have to do to the top. So we get 15I square root of 2 over 4I squared times 2. Well, the 15I squared stays the same. Or, I'm sorry, the 15I square root of 2 stays the same. Remember that I squared is negative 1, and then 4 times 2 is 8. So we have 15I square root of 2 over negative 8. All right, and now let's take a look at example number 7. We have an equation here that's 4x squared plus 25 equals negative 23. So we're just going to solve for x here. So we're going to subtract 25 from both sides. And then we're going to divide both sides by 4. Well, now we have x squared, so we need to take the square root. Now remember, anytime you take the square root, you need that plus or minus. So we have x equals plus or minus the square root of negative 12. Well, remember, we can't have square root of negative, so we have to pull out that I. But then also, remember that 12 breaks up into square root of 4 and square root of 3. So the square root of 4 is 2, and then the square root of 3 stays the same. And I just wrote a 2. So let's change that to a 3. And then normally we write it this way. 2I square root of 3. So x equals plus or minus 2I square root of 3. And that's our introduction to the imaginary number.